So this video will cover the questions you will be asked at your marriage-based green card interview. So just to be clear, this is about the first interview, right? This isn't a Stokes interview. This is the first interview you and your U.S. citizen permanent resident spouse show up at for your marriage-based green card. So the questions are split into two separate categories, right? So the first one are questions related to the validity of the marriage, right? Whether this is a bona fide marriage. So the questions that you should expect, and I tell everyone, these questions regarding to whether this is a valid marriage, I've seen them asked at every interview I've ever been at, so you might as well prepare for them. First of all, right, how did you meet, right? Like just questions related to how, you first met, and then follow up to that is how did the first meeting evolve into a romantic relationship? So when was the second date, and how do you go from meeting to a proposal, right? There's going to be follow-up questions about the proposal. Was it a formal proposal? Where did it occur? What happened? Tell everyone, do not worry if this wasn't the proposal that you see on TV and with the ring and all of that. It's not the end of the world if it wasn't, especially during COVID. So many of our clients didn't propose to each other that way, and that's fine, but the officer will most likely ask about the proposal, so you should know and expect that question. The next set of questions is going to have to do with the actual marriage ceremony, right? Where was your marriage ceremony? What happened? Who was there, right? And again, don't worry if it was a city hall or just a court wedding and not many people were there, right? So many, I would say at least half of our clients at these interviews say, look, we want to plan a big wedding ceremony, but we're waiting for this whole immigration saga to end before we do so. And that's perfectly fine, right? Don't be alarmed if that's the answer you have to give, but be prepared that the officer will ask. I can say that usually in my experience, the officers look really favorably on the fact if family and friends are at the wedding or at least present via Zoom. So that's a question you can anticipate. From this, the officers very often go into questions about family members, right? So whether you've met each other's family, parents, siblings, who do you know? Do they know each other? How often have you met? Again, I tell everyone, for very often, right, of the family is abroad, right? The foreign nationals' family is abroad, and you may not have met them. And that's not the end of the world. But then the question very often comes up of, okay, but have you done any Zoom calls, Skype, anything like that, FaceTime, right? Have you ever met them via video? Do they know about you? And I tell everyone, make sure to bring that up, because the officer doesn't want to know the particularities. They just want to make sure that this is a real marriage, right? And meeting each other's family is a big component of that. So just make sure, you're able to answer those questions. The other questions that I see come up with family is they ask, do you know each other's parents' names? What's your significant, what's your husband or wife's parents, your father's name, wife's name? This is a great question, and I think it's great when the officers ask it, because the answer is right on the 485 on the adjustment of status form, so the officer can verify whether what you're saying is true. So I definitely think you should prepare for the questions about each other's families. The next set of questions I see come up very often here have to do with your day-to-day routine. So who goes to work? Where does your spouse work? What's your day-to-day routine like, right? Now, all of these questions, right, it's impossible to predict all of them. And what I tell everyone is just general tips about answering these questions, right, is I don't know is a perfectly acceptable answer. You may just not remember. You're under oath. You should only tell the truth. So if you don't remember, just say, officer, I don't remember. I'm really sorry. Can you just ask me another question? And that's perfectly fine. So many people are nervous. I've had clients forget their spouse's name, their wedding date, their spouse's birthday, and they still all got green cards, right? It's not just one question. One question doesn't kill the case. It's the totality of the evidence. So I don't know or I don't remember is a perfectly acceptable answer, right? Similarly to that, I don't want you answering any questions you don't understand. If the officer is mumbling or wearing a mask or whatever it may be, I do not want you to answer a question you don't understand, because you're under oath. Just be polite. Ask the officer, hey, officer, could you please repeat this, I didn't understand you. And what I tell all my clients is, even if you have to do this 7 times, that's perfectly okay, but you don't answer questions that you don't understand because you're under oath. The next very important thing I tell everyone is be polite, right? So the officers, many of them are veterans, but anyway, this is a tough job that they're in, right? So first of all, many of them have a military, training, and they're used to it. The yes sir, no sir, yes ma'am, just politeness goes a really long way, and also shows respect to them for the job they're doing, and it's an important job. So I tell everyone, be very polite in your answers. Don't be rude, right? Another tip about the answers is make sure you don't give too long-winded answers, right? So when you ask you, how did you meet? Don't start with your boyfriend in the 2nd grade or girlfriend in the 3rd grade, right? Because they have an hour for this interview. They don't want to spend longer. It's they have a schedule and they want to get to their lunch break. So if you can give short answers at the same time. If you need to explain the answer you're given, of course, give it the extra time and the extra coloring that you need in order that you can explain yourself. But that's important. Also, the officer will be directing questions to each of you, right? So if the officer cuts you off and said, for example, sir, I asked your wife about this, don't take this personally, right? It's just the officer wants to get the answer for this question from one of you, and is directing that question to one of you. So this way, just follow the officer's lead. What I tell everyone is the best interviews are those where this turns into a conversation. It's not an interrogation. It really is not an interrogation. What it is there's someone who needs to verify that everything you're telling is the truth, and they want to have a conversation with you about this. So the more you can, relax and just talk to the officer, the better it will be for your case, in my experience, right? And look at the officer not as your enemy, but the gatekeeper, right? This is the person that if they're satisfied and they believe you just based on your mannerisms and everything, that person can give you the green card, right? So that's, I think, really, really critical for the valid marriage part of this interview. The final set of questions, right, are going to be directed at the foreign national applicant, right, at the foreign national spouse. And they're going to be all those yes and no questions and that are listed in the adjustment of status application form. So have you ever been arrested? Have you ever violated your immigration status? Have you ever worked without employment authorization? Have you been a member of the Communist Party? Do you have military training, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? The reason the officer is asking these questions is to determine your eligibility for permanent residence, right, for obtaining a green card. So the reason all these yes and no answers are so critical is because they determine whether you're eligible or not eligible to obtain permanent residence. So if you have any questions, right, regarding any of these answers you've given, obviously contact an immigration attorney who can help you through these. But the most important part for this interview, for the purposes of this video, is don't take offense. The officer is not asking these questions to offend you. They're just making sure they're following protocol and they're asking the questions they're required to ask. So once you go through all of these questions, the yes and no part, at the end of that, the officer will make you sign the application. If it's a paper form application, some offices have moved electronic. In those cases, you're going to sign on a tablet. But the bottom line is, at the end, you're signing off on all of these answers. So again, it's very important, right? You're under oath, signing that what you said is nothing but the truth. So make sure you answer all these questions truthfully. Once this part ends, right, the interview questions, the question part of the interview, and the interview is coming to an end at this point. The big thing I tell everyone to make sure at the end of the interview, the officer should ask you to confirm your address. Maybe it's at the beginning of the interview, but at some point your address should be confirmed by the officer. Make sure that the officer knows your current address where you want to receive mail, and also your full legal name and your date of birth, and all that information is accurate. You should be asked these questions at the very beginning of the interview, but if you're not, it's important for you to bring these up. The reason is this is the information that will be on the green card, right? Name, date of birth, very important on your green card. Also, if you give the wrong address, and unfortunately this happens where clients forget to let us know or let the USCIS know that they've moved, USCIS will send your green card to a different address where you may not be able to get it. This is a very important legal document that you need to have. You can't just have it floating in the mail somewhere. So the bottom line is, make sure you update the address and make sure the correct address is on file with the government. If one of our attorneys, if I'm at the interview, I will definitely make sure that this happens, but just know this and prepare for this. At the end of the interview, right? Don't just stand up and leave and say, thank you, officer, right? Obviously, you're anxious. Obviously, you waited a long time for this. I remember my green card interview. I was super nervous, and then, I wanted to know what's going to happen next. Ask the question, how did we do? What comes next? Don't just leave, right? Ask the officer. The officer is expecting this question, and it's completely reasonable for you to ask this question. So ask, right? If the officer will give you one of a few options, right? Option one is you're recommended for approval. Great news. You're going to receive your permanent residence card, your green card in the mail in anywhere from a month to 2 months, which is fantastic. Other alternative answers are, I'm going to issue a request for evidence because I'm not satisfied with, proof of the marriage, the validity of the marriage, or any other facts you've given. For example, if you have arrest, they may ask for arrest records, things of that nature. That is not the end of the world. Don't want you to panic. This happens. Sometimes the officer just, wants to have more documents in order to be able to approve the case. In that case, obviously, you're going to have to respond with further evidence. So that's another option, a request for evidence. Another option the officer may give you is that everything looks good, but we have to just make sure, run some background checks and just have to review a few things in the file. Now, every case there's a background check that every single case goes through. I don't want you to worry about that if it's the standard background check. So even if the officer recommends the case for approval, there's still going to be a standard background check. However, if the officer says, look, we need to review a certain fact or we need to do some more research, it may mean that they see something in the file that they're worried about and they want to review further. In that case, what will happen basically is that you will receive either a decision, right, an approval or a denial, or a request for evidence or notice of intent to deny in the mail. So basically, what that response means that you will hear further communication from the government by mail. I tell everyone, if you're told that the case is being held for review, just ask the officer how long the officer thinks it will take for you to hear something. Obviously, be polite about this. The officer may not give you, most likely the officer will not commit to a particular date, but I think it's worth asking. And then the final option is that the case gets denied. That's very rare. In most cases, for your case to be denied at this first interview, it means that you were probably ineligible from the get-go, or there's a major issue with the case. In most cases, if the issue is the validity of the marriage, they will either issue a RFE or ask you to attend a second interview, with a Stokes interview, in which you're separated and asked more questions. But yes, those are the questions you can anticipate at your marriage-based green card interview, and I hope you found this video helpful.